An injured dog was left alone until a stranger changed its life. It lay there in the rain, still as a shadow, broken in the hush of the early morning. Anyone passing by would missed it if they hadn't taken a second glance, and that's exactly why it had gone unnoticed for days. The tiny dog, ribs visible beneath a patchy, mud-caked coat, rested in the gutter beside a busy highway, a silent testament to heartbreak. Most vehicles roared past without so much as slowing down. The headlights briefly illuminated a small, crumpled figure before vanishing into the distance. The world had become a blur of steel and speed, and this wounded soul had slipped through the cracks. Yet on this day, fate had different plans. Beneath the incessant drum of raindrops, the dog's sides heaved, soft, shallow breaths. An ugly gash marred its flank, dried blood encrusting matted fur. Each slight movement caused the creature to flinch, and a trembling whine of pain escaped its lips whenever its body reminded it that, yes, it was still alive. That desperate whine was nearly lost in the barrage of rain hitting concrete. But if anyone had been close enough, if anyone had really listened, they would have heard a faint plea. Please, help me. The morning light crept over the horizon, painting the bleak sky with a muted wash of gray. Cars and trucks sped by, drivers anxious to make their commutes, to find warmth and dry clothes, or simply to outrun the gloom. A sense of urgency bristled in the air, and it left no room for compassion, or so it seemed. The dog barely clung to consciousness, teetering on the edge of an abyss. Hunger, infection, and exhaustion had become a venom coursing through its veins. Still there was a spark in its eyes, a stubborn refusal to let go. Life, fragile as a single candle flame in a storm, flickered behind its pain. Then in the distance, a certain car slowed down. Tires hissed against the wet asphalt. The driver leaned forward, peering through a fogged-up windshield. Squinting through the sheets of rain, she thought she saw something in the gutter, a figure that might have been a soaked rag or a lost piece of clothing. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Yet something made her heart clench. Instinct, or maybe a soft voice from her past, urged her to pull over. Her name was Sandra. She was running late for work, anxiety chewing at her nerves. She had an important meeting, a sales pitch that could define her career trajectory for the next few months. The rational part of her mind screamed at her to continue driving. But an odd tug, a compelling sense of duty, told her she needed to check. She needed to see if that small shape needed help or if it was just trash caught in a gutter. Better safe than sorry, she thought, never imagining that this small detour would change not only the dog's life but her own. As she carefully stepped out of the car, the rain plastered her hair to her forehead. Her coat was quickly soaked. She jogged over to the spot, scanning the roadside. At first, she saw only strewn plastic bags and scattered debris. Then her eyes landed on the trembling bundle of fur. The dog was nearly hidden in the shadow of the curb, a black and brown form that blended into the wet concrete. Sandra froze, her breath catching in her throat. The dog, with half-lidded eyes, looked back at her, a strange mixture of terror and faint hope shimmering in its gaze. "Oh my God," Sandra murmured, kneeling down. Her pant legs soaked up dirty water from the gutter. Up close, the injury looked far worse. A long, jagged tear in the dog's hindquarters, possibly from a collision or sharp metal. The wound looks infected, edges crusted with dried blood, fur peeled away in places. The smell was musty, tinged with infection and old rain. The dog whimpered softly, trying to shrink away, but it was too weak to move more than an inch. At that moment, Sandra felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She was never particularly adept at dealing with blood or medical emergencies. She'd grown up a city girl, used to letting professionals handle such crises. Part of her, maybe the instinctual part that disliked seeing suffering, spurred her into action. She carefully reached out, her voice trembling. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." The dog stiffened, too exhausted to put up any significant resistance. It let out a weak yelp as Sandra's hand brushed against its side. She saw its fear. It had faced cruelty before, the kind that teaches an animal to expect pain from human hands. Guilt and compassion warred inside her. She knew rationally that she couldn't leave it here, not without trying to help. But what could she do? She wasn't a vet, and she had no medical supplies in her car, no knowledge of how to care for an animal in this state. With rain slanting into her eyes, Sandra looked back at her car, hesitating. A few more minutes and she'd definitely be late for her presentation. But the dog was dying. She could see it, a desperate flicker of life about to be extinguished. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't be able to live with herself if she just drove off. Summoning courage, she slipped off her coat and gently wrapped the trembling dog, being careful not to press too hard on the wound. "It's going to be okay," she said, voice cracking from the swirl of emotions choking her. She moved as gently as possible, lifting the dog into her arms. Though it was small, it felt heavier than she'd expected, likely because fear weighed as much as flesh in moments like this. The dog let out a feeble cry, then fell limp in her arms. Dripping water all over the interior, Sandra placed the bundle on the passenger seat, adjusting the vents to blow warm air toward it. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called her office, leaving a breathless voicemail that some emergency had come up. She couldn't contain the adrenaline-fueled tremor in her voice. Her sense of guilt for missing the meeting warred with her compassion, but compassion won out. She typed "emergency vet clinic" into her GPS with frantic intensity, heart pounding. The dog, silent except for shuddering breaths, gazed at her with an odd mix of fear and surrender. Sandra navigated slick roads, hazard lights flashing, as she followed the directions to the nearest 24-hour veterinary hospital. Traffic was unkind. Every red light felt like an eternity, every passing minute seemed to drain the dog's life. She kept talking softly to it, repeating reassurances she wasn't sure it could understand. Each time she glanced over, her heart twisted. She wondered if this battered creature had once known love. Perhaps it had a family, a home, a warm bed. Or maybe it had always wandered the streets, invisible until a car's wheels or a cruel hand ended its freedom with violence. Finally, the neon sign of a veterinary clinic glowed through the downpour. Sandra pulled into the parking lot, tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. She grabbed the dog again, trying to keep the makeshift coat from slipping off. Rain pummeled them both as she sprinted for the door. The receptionist glanced up, eyes widening at the sight of a soaked woman clutching a lifeless-looking dog. Without hesitation, staff members ushered Sandra into a treatment room, taking the dog from her arms as she stumbled behind, uncertain of her role now. Vets and technicians converged around the table, snapping on gloves, hooking the dog to monitors, disinfecting the wound. Their focus was intense, urgent. Sandra stood in a corner, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Her mind whirled with images of the dog lying in the gutter, each detail playing on a loop. Time became elastic, moments stretched, sped up, and then slowed again. She caught snippets of conversation. Severe blood loss, possible internal injuries, high risk of infection. One of the vets approached her with a clipboard, explaining that they'd do all they could, but the dog's condition was critical. They needed immediate surgery to clean and close the gash, and the costs could be significant. Did Sandra consent to proceed? She blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. She had no idea what the dog's future looked like, but in that instant none of it mattered. "Yes, do it," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "Save him, please." With a shaking hand, she signed the necessary forms. A swirl of guilt and responsibility sank in as she realized she was personally committing to footing a bill that could be hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. But no matter how uncertain she felt, leaving the dog to die wasn't an option. She lingered in the waiting room, adrenaline ebbing and exhaustion settling in. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She was no longer sure if she was shivering from cold or nerves. A patch of her coat was still drenched, and her hair dripped small puddles onto the linoleum. She texted her boss an apology for missing the meeting, phone shaking in her hand as she typed. Even if this cost her job, she couldn't regret it. Hours blurred. Vet techs breezed in and out, calling out names, bringing updates for other clients. Occasionally, someone would glance at Sandra with sympathy, seeing her state of anxiety. When a tall woman in scrubs finally approached her, face etched with both relief and caution, Sandra's heart lodged in her throat. "The dog made it through surgery," the vet began gently. "We had to stitch up the wound and there's a risk of infection, but he pulled through the procedure. That's a good sign. But he's not out of danger yet. We'll need to keep him here for several days, monitor him, and provide IV fluids and antibiotics. It'll be a process." Sandra felt tears slide down her cheeks, mixing with the lingering dampness of her rain-soaked face. She mumbled her thanks, voice barely audible. It felt unreal, like she was in some dream where she'd saved a dog she didn't even know. Every rational part of her told her that she'd done something reckless, that she might lose her job or end up in debt she couldn't manage. Yet a deeper, quieter voice told her she'd just done something right. She was allowed a brief peek at the dog in recovery. He lay on a small bed in a steel kennel, an IV line taped to one foreleg, bandages wrapped around his hindquarters. He was heavily sedated, eyes closed in exhausted sleep. But his breathing was more stable now, his body no longer vibrating with pain-induced tremors. Sandra felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. She found herself whispering, "Hang in there, buddy. You're gonna be okay." Back in her apartment that night, sleep came fitfully. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured him alone in that kennel, reliant on human kindness to pull through. She worried, what if he never heals? What if he does but nobody wants him? She told herself she could find a rescue or a kind family if it came to that. Though she'd grown up with pets, hamsters and goldfish, she'd never had a dog in her adult life. Her building allowed pets, but only under strict conditions, and she wasn't sure if she could handle the responsibility. Still, the thought of leaving the dog to an uncertain fate churned her insides. She resolved to take it one step at a time. The following morning, she returned to the vet clinic. The dog was still recovering, still sedated to manage pain. Over the next few days, she visited whenever she could, before or after work, sometimes slipping out during lunch if she could swing it. The staff got used to seeing her slump in, tired but determined, carrying a fresh blanket or specialized dog treats for when he was well enough to eat. They told her his condition was cautiously optimistic. The infection risk loomed, but each day he grew a bit stronger. The gash was cleaned, healing slowly. One afternoon, a week later, Sandra was led to the recovery room again. She found him awake, staring with cloudy eyes through the metal bars. Seeing him conscious for the first time, she felt an odd jolt. He was still thin, ears ragged and one turned at a funny angle, likely from an old injury. But his eyes, dark, soulful, told her he was more than just the battered creature she found in a gutter. He watched her approach, ears twitching. She offered her hand through the bars, speaking softly. He sniffed, tentative, and gently touched her fingertips with his nose. That fleeting contact felt electric, a spark that bridged fear and trust. When the vet pronounced he was stable enough to go home, if Sandra was prepared to provide ongoing care, she realized she couldn't bear to abandon him. The question of her ability to handle the responsibility felt secondary. Whatever hurdles existed, she knew she had to try. So she took him home. With the clinic's guidance, she set up a quiet corner of her living room with a soft bed, food and water bowls, and a protective cover for the area where he could rest comfortably without straining his wound. She filled the prescriptions for antibiotics and pain medication, got instructions on cleaning and rebandaging. That first ride home, she drove with one hand on the steering wheel, the other gently resting on the dog's head. He lay in the passenger seat again, but this time there was no frantic rush, no choking stench of blood. He was fragile, but his gaze was calmer, a softness that suggested maybe he knew, somewhere inside, that he was safe. At her apartment building, she earned stares from neighbors, some of whom eyed the dog warily. He was, after all, a half-starved stray with bandages around his hindquarters, walking with a limp. But Sandra just offered small smiles, focusing on navigating him to the elevator without causing him too much strain. She talked to him in soothing tones as they rode up to her floor. "Almost there, boy. I've got a nice soft bed for you and some water. Everything's gonna be all right." Once inside, he sniffed around, hesitant, tail carried low. He limped to the corner where she'd prepared his bed. With a heavy sigh, almost a groan, he settled down, gingerly lying on his side. Sandra knelt next to him, letting him smell her hands again. Then, with gentle movements, she scratched behind his ears. He let out a soft huff, something that sounded like relief. Days turned into a routine. Sandra juggled her job and the dog's care. She'd rush home to clean his wound, administer medication, and offer support as he slowly regained his strength. His appetite was meager at first, but it picked up. She discovered he had a particular fondness for boiled chicken when cut into tiny cubes, easy on his healing body. The first time she caught him wagging his tail, just a slight, cautious swish, her eyes stung with tears. She named him Chance because that was what she'd given him, a chance at life. And each day that name resonated more deeply. Chance was timid, especially around strangers. The sound of a slamming door or a dropped object could make him flinch, trembling with memories of the street or of past abuse. But with Sandra, he blossomed, inch by inch. She realized he was gentle, craving affection, but unsure how to ask for it. She gave it freely, letting him set the pace. Some nights, if he was restless or seemed to be in pain, she'd wake up and find him staring out the window, as though reminding himself that he was inside a warm apartment, not on a cold street. One cold evening, a few weeks into his recovery, Sandra was working on her laptop, trying to catch up on tasks she'd neglected due to all the vet visits. A clap of thunder echoed outside. Chance sprang up, whimpering. He hobbled over to her, pressing himself against her leg, shaking. Sandra set aside her work, heart aching. She slowly wrapped an arm around him and whispered, "It's okay. You're safe." As if finally letting himself believe that, he collapsed onto her feet, tail tucked between his legs, but trusting her enough to stay close. That single moment held the essence of everything that had changed. A dog who once lay dying in the rain now sought comfort from a human who refused to walk away. Weeks passed. Chance's limp started to improve, the bandages came off, and the ugly scar on his hindquarters began to shrink. Sandra noticed he had a slight hitch in his gait, likely permanent damage from whatever had hit him, but it didn't stop him from slowly exploring more of the apartment. His fur, once patchy and matted, grew back in soft tufts. She brushed him gently, careful around his old wounds, and sometimes found herself talking to him about mundane worries. He'd watch her face with unwavering focus, as though understanding every word. But the world wasn't content to let them simply settle into comfort. Life, as Sandra learned, had a way of tossing challenges like stones into still water, creating ripples that grew into waves. One Saturday, as she scrolled through her emails, she saw one from her landlord. The message was curt, reminding tenants of the building's pet policy. Specifically, it stated that any dog over 20 pounds or with a history of aggression is not permitted. Her pulse quickened. Chance weighed more than 20 pounds, and though he had no history of aggression, she had no formal papers to prove it. In her lease, there was a vague clause that management could request removal of a pet if they deemed it a liability. Sandra felt dread coil in her stomach. She immediately wrote back, explaining how she'd rescued Chance and that he was gentle. But the landlord remained indifferent, citing potential insurance issues and building regulations. Sandra's heart sank. She feared they might evict her or force her to rehome Chance. The thought of giving him up after everything they'd gone through paralyzed her with anguish. Desperate, she searched for solutions. She considered moving, but the cost and logistics were daunting, especially on her salary. She also thought about specialized training or certificates that could help prove Chance wasn't dangerous. Meanwhile, the landlord set a review date to assess whether the dog could stay. The clock was ticking, and the tension spilled over into every moment. Sandra found her mind constantly wandering to worst-case scenarios. In the midst of this, Chance faced his own internal battles. Though he'd grown more comfortable, he still had nightmares, episodes where he'd twitch and whimper in his sleep, as if reliving some old trauma. Sandra sometimes woke in the night to find him pacing, unsettled. She'd coax him to her side, gently petting him until he calmed. In those quiet hours, she realized how fragile he still was, how much he depended on her not just for food and shelter, but for emotional security. The day of the landlord's review arrived. Sandra meticulously cleaned her apartment, arranging everything so it looked tidy and safe. She even put a soft muzzle on Chance, though it felt like a betrayal of their trust, to ensure there could be no question about aggression. When the landlord came, accompanied by a stern-faced building manager, Chance stayed quietly by Sandra's side. He eyed the strangers warily but didn't growl or cower, which Sandra took as a good sign. She explained his gentle nature, how he'd been through so much and was recovering. They stared at the scar on Chance's hindquarters and the slight droop of his left ear. One of them took notes. Sandra's heart pounded at how cold it felt, turning this living, breathing soul into a checklist. In the end, they said they'd consider the matter carefully. She'd receive an official response within a week. The waiting period was nerve-wracking, a slow torture that frayed Sandra's nerves. She found herself apologizing to Chance when she felt particularly hopeless. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper, hugging him tight. "I promised I'd protect you, and I'm trying." He'd lick her face, tail wagging gently, as if forgiving her in advance for any outcome. All the while, she sensed something changing in herself. That shy, hesitant part of her, the one that used to avoid conflict and shy away from responsibilities, was evolving. She felt a fierce protectiveness, almost maternal, fueling her. For once in her life, she was ready to fight for something she believed in, and that clarity brought a kind of strength she never knew she had. When the landlord's verdict came, it was complicated. They said they wouldn't force removal of the dog immediately, but wanted written assurance from a certified trainer that Chance wasn't aggressive. Also, if any tenant complained about barking or threats, they reserved the right to revisit eviction. It wasn't perfect, but it was a lifeline. Sandra latched onto it with relief. She arranged a meeting with a reputable dog trainer who specialized in rehabilitating rescue dogs, hoping to get official documentation. The trainer, a burly man named Victor with a gentle demeanor, visited one evening. He observed Chance's behavior, how he interacted with Sandra, how he reacted to strangers, how he handled simple commands. Chance was timid but surprisingly quick to learn. Victor noted the dog's body language, ears pricked, tail low but wagging, eyes focused. After an hour of gentle exercises, Victor nodded approvingly. "He's a sweet boy," he said. "Doesn't show any signs of aggression. Just a bit of fear, which is natural given his past." Sandra let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Victor agreed to write a letter stating that Chance posed no threat and was undergoing training to improve socialization. That letter, once delivered to the landlord, eased the immediate crisis. Sandra felt as though they'd dodged a bullet, though she kept in mind that any future complaints could still jeopardize everything. Still, day by day, the bond between Chance and Sandra grew. His confidence bloomed. He started greeting her at the door with a cautious wag, brightening her darkest moods. She discovered he loved squeaky toys, especially ones shaped like small animals. He'd shred them in minutes, tail wagging the entire time, before proudly bringing the scraps to her as if to say, "Look, I've conquered it." She indulged his taste for occasional walks in the neighborhood, though she kept them brief at first due to his limp. The sunlight and fresh air seemed to renew him. Then came the first major setback since his rescue. Late one night, as they both dozed on the couch, Chance suddenly jerked awake, panting heavily, eyes wild with terror. He leaped off the couch, stumbled, and ran into the coffee table, knocking it over with a crash. Sandra jolted upright, heart thudding. Chance cowered in a corner, shaking so violently it seemed like he might collapse. Hurriedly, Sandra knelt beside him, speaking in hushed, soothing tones. It took several minutes before he stilled, his breathing slowing. She pressed her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's okay. Whatever it was, it's over," she whispered, though she could feel his heartbeat racing. She sensed it was a flashback to something traumatic. The docile, sweet dog she knew had momentarily vanished, replaced by raw, animal terror. If anything, it deepened her empathy for him. "What horrors did you see, buddy? What did humans do to you?" Over time, with patience and gentle reassurance, Chance's episodes became less frequent. The trainer, Victor, recommended consistent routines and safe spaces. Sandra followed every bit of advice, determined to help Chance heal not just physically but emotionally. Their journey was anything but smooth. Yet every small victory, a day without nightmares, a successful walk past a stranger, felt monumental. During this ongoing transformation, word of Sandra's rescue story began to spread at her workplace. A she was friendly with had shared it, and soon people were approaching Sandra in the break room, saying they'd heard about her heroic dog rescue. Normally, she disliked the spotlight, but now she felt a spark of pride. However, she also faced a subtle wave of resentment from a few individuals who grumbled that her recent absences and tardiness had burdened the team. It was office politics at play. She tried to keep her head down, remain professional, and make up for lost time on her tasks. Despite the tension, some showed genuine support. A few even donated dog supplies or offered to dog sit if she ever needed help. It revealed a kindness in people she'd overlooked before, reminding her that compassion could be contagious. It was as if Chance's story had awakened some communal empathy. But as summer turned to fall, fate decided to test them again. One cool Sunday morning, while out for a walk, Chance and Sandra passed an older man walking a small terrier. They paused politely, giving the other dog space. Suddenly, a car backfired down the street, a loud pop that reverberated like a gunshot. Chance recoiled, let out a frightened yelp, and twisted sideways. The leash jerked in Sandra's hand. She lost her grip. In a heartbeat, Chance bolted, limping but driven by pure panic. Sandra shouted his name, fear slicing through her. He disappeared around a corner in seconds. She sprinted after him, lungs burning, adrenaline spiking. She turned onto another street, scanning desperately for his shape. Strangers watched her run past, alarmed by her frantic expression. She called his name over and over, voice growing hoarse. No sign of him. The thought of him alone and terrified, possibly darting into traffic, made her stomach twist in knots. For hours she searched, scouring the neighborhood. She enlisted neighbors, calling out, "Chance, Chance boy, please come." She put up hastily made flyers, scribbling her phone number beneath a photo on her phone. The sun sank lower, shadows lengthened, and still no sign of him. By nightfall she was physically and emotionally exhausted, tears staining her cheeks. She headed home, hoping he might find his way back. But he wasn't waiting outside her door. The apartment felt empty, cold. She spent a sleepless night pacing, periodically calling for him from her balcony, tears in her voice. Guilt weighed heavily. She should have held onto the leash, should have been prepared for loud noises. Memories flashed of finding him in the rain, broken and alone. She couldn't bear the thought that he might be reliving that horror, or worse, that she'd never see him again. Early the next morning, Sandra resumed the search. She extended her radius, combing through alleys, checking under cars, stopping by local businesses. She contacted local shelters, leaving descriptions. No one had seen a scared dog limping around. Desperation gnawed at her. The possibility that he'd ventured far away, lost, frightened, haunted her. By the third day she hit a wall of despair. Her apartment remained silent. She'd barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. She kept her phone ringer at max volume, hoping for a call from someone who'd seen him or found him. Every time it rang with a telemarketer or her heart sank. But then late that evening she received a text from an unknown number. She opened it, breath catching. It read, "I think I saw your dog. Scar on hind leg. Limp. He's hiding under a trailer in a construction site near Greenwood Street." Without hesitating, Sandra threw on her shoes, grabbed a flashlight and rushed out. Greenwood Street was about 2 miles away, farther than she'd expected him to run. She parked near the address, heart pounding. It was a deserted construction site with half-built walls and scattered debris. Streetlights cast eerie shadows on metal scaffolding. She stepped cautiously over gravel and broken boards, calling softly, "Chance. Chance, boy, it's me." Her flashlight swept the area. At first she saw nothing but hollow rooms, silent except for the wind. She felt panic rising. What if he's gone? But then, toward the far end of the site, she heard a faint whimper. She followed the sound, stepping carefully through a maze of tools and lumber. And there, beneath a rusted utility trailer, she glimpsed two dark eyes reflecting her flashlight beam. He was trembling, wedged as far back as he could go, muzzle caked in dirt. His tail was tucked so tightly it was practically invisible. At the sight of her, he let out a low whine, a sound that spoke volumes of both fear and recognition. Sandra sank to her knees, not caring about the mud. She held out her hand, voice trembling. "Oh God, Chance, I'm so sorry. I'm here now. Please come out." At first he didn't move, paralyzed by terror. She stayed there, speaking in a gentle murmur, letting her voice wash over him. Finally, with slow, jerky motions, he crawled forward. The moment he was within reach, she gently slid an arm around him, tears slipping down her face. His body was bony, caked in grime, and his paw pads were torn and raw from running. He smelled of old garbage, a pungent stench of fear and neglect. But Sandra only felt overwhelming relief. She buried her face in his fur, whispering, "You're safe now. I've got you." Chance trembled against her, as though releasing days of tension. She eased him out from under the trailer, careful not to hurt his paw pads. He followed her, leaning into her side for support. On the drive home, she draped him in a towel and fed him water from a bottle cap. He drank greedily, desperate. Sandra stroked his ears, heart swelling with gratitude that he was still alive. At home, she carefully bathed him, washing away the dirt and fear. He stood unsteadily, sometimes losing balance on the slick tub surface. She used warm water and mild soap, gentle as a mother with a newborn. Tears blurred her vision. "He came back to me," she kept thinking. "He's alive." Afterward, she dried him off, fed him a bowl of warm chicken broth with bits of food mixed in. He wolfed it down. For the first time in days, she felt a calm settle over her. That night, as Chance slept on his bed, occasionally letting out small whimpers, Sandra kept a vigil. She realized their bond was something words couldn't fully capture. She'd found him broken in a gutter. He'd found refuge in her. She'd nearly lost him once more, but fate intervened again, as if reminding her that some connections can't be severed easily. She understood that from now on, they needed each other in a way only those who have been through trauma together can comprehend. Time passed. Chance's confidence began to grow again. With the help of Victor, they worked on desensitizing him to loud noises. They practiced walking in safe areas, gradually increasing exposure to mild triggers. Chance never became a carefree dog. He carried his past with him like a faint scar that would never fully fade. But he learned to trust more, especially in Sandra's presence. And Sandra, for her part, rediscovered parts of herself she didn't know existed: resilience, nurturing, a fierce loyalty. She noticed others around her were touched by their story. A neighbor who used to scowl now asked how Chance was doing. Who once rolled their eyes offered to help if she needed someone to let Chance out during the day. It was as if the act of caring for a wounded animal rippled outward, unlocking empathy in unexpected places. Months turned into a year. Chance was no longer the trembling skeleton she'd found in the rain. His fur was thick and glossy, covering the scars like a gentle blanket. He retained a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the accident, or cruelty he'd once endured, but it didn't stop him from cautiously wagging his tail, from enjoying short games of tug or chasing a toy across the living room rug. The memory of the gutter, the infection, the surgery, all of it seemed like a distant nightmare. Except nightmares, as they both knew, have a way of leaving a mark. One crisp autumn day, Sandra took Chance to a nearby park. It was quiet, the sky brilliantly blue, leaves ablaze with orange and red. She found a secluded area, away from busy streets and sudden noises, where Chance could roam a little without fear. He sniffed around, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was still there. As she watched him nose through piles of leaves, tail swaying, she felt a surge of love and pride. It was a sight she once couldn't have imagined when he lay dying in that gutter. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were happy tears. She recalled the countless moments of fear and uncertainty they'd shared, how many times she'd doubted her ability to care for a severely injured dog, and how many barriers they'd overcome. It was as though the park was their testament to resilience. Then something caught Chance's attention, a squirrel perhaps, and he bounded forward, tail wagging with puppy-like glee. It was a clumsy run, hampered by his old injury, but still a run. Sandra laughed, calling after him, voice echoing with joy. Chance paused and turned back, ears perked, waiting for her to catch up. In that instant she felt a deep, almost spiritual gratitude. He was not just a dog she rescued. He was a symbol of second chances. The day took on a dreamlike quality. They spent hours wandering the park trails, pausing so Chance could investigate tree trunks and shrubs. Other walkers passed by with their dogs, some stopping to say hello. Chance would shy away at first, but with gentle coaxing, he sometimes mustered enough courage to sniff another dog. Each success, no matter how small, filled Sandra with hope. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft pink hues, Sandra found a bench overlooking a duck pond. She sat, patting the spot beside her. Chance hopped up, leaning against her leg, content to watch the water ripple. Two mallards glided by, oblivious to the pair on the shore. Sandra stroked Chance's fur, which was warm beneath her palm. She sensed his contentment, felt his shallow breaths, and remembered the moment she'd first lifted his broken body from the gutter. The transformation was staggering. "I'm proud of you," she murmured to him. "You fought so hard. And I'll keep fighting for you for as long as it takes." Chance turned his head, gazing at her with gentle eyes. She could almost imagine he understood, that he was saying thank you in his own silent way. As evening wrapped the park in a quiet hush, they headed back to the car. Chance hopped in with only a moment's hesitation, a far cry from the trembling dog who'd once cowered on the passenger seat. Sandra turned the key, the engine's soft purr a comforting reminder of how far they'd come. Memories spiraled in her mind. The emergency vet, the financial strain, the nights spent holding him as he trembled. The landlord's threats, the frantic search when he ran off, the euphoria of finding him huddled under a trailer. It was all part of their story, a story of brokenness, hope, and healing. The next day, life resumed its normal pace. Sandra went to work, Chance dozed on his bed, and the world spun on. Yet something profound had shifted. People around Sandra noticed it too. She had a new light in her eyes, a quiet confidence. Chance, on the other hand, had discovered a fragile but real sense of belonging. In the months that followed, their bond continued to deepen. Sandra would come home from the office, exhausted, and the sound of Chance's tail thumping against the floor was enough to melt away the day's stress. Sometimes they'd doze together on the couch, the soft lull of the television playing in the background. On weekends, they'd visit the park again or explore a new place, always careful to keep Chance feeling safe. She'd watch as he ventured a bit farther each time, curiosity slowly overtaking fear. And then, in a moment she could never have predicted, everything reached a poignant climax. It was a chilly winter afternoon when she received a message from a rescue organization she'd contacted months ago, looking for any clues about Chance's past. The message revealed that someone had filed a lost dog notice around the time Sandra first found him. The description matched Chance, a small dog with a scar on his left ear. The dates and general location lined up. The rescue group had only just pieced it together through cross-referencing records. Sandra's heart plummeted. Did Chance have a family before she found him? Had she, unwittingly, kept him from being reunited with his rightful owners? Torn by conflicting emotions, she reached out to the phone number provided. A man answered. His voice was tight, laced with concern when she mentioned the dog's description. He insisted that yes, they'd lost a dog who might fit that description. They'd recently given up searching actively but had never stopped hoping. He asked if they could meet. Sandra's throat constricted. What if they demanded to take Chance back? Legally, the dog was theirs if they could prove ownership. But was it truly in Chance's best interest? She arranged a meeting at the vet clinic, wanting a professional there who knew Chance's story. When the day arrived, Sandra sat with Chance by her side, nervous. Her mind reeled with questions. What if his original owners had been abusive? What if they were loving and circumstances forced them apart? Had they left him injured on the roadside? A couple walked in, the man from the phone and a woman with anxious eyes. They froze at the sight of Chance. His ears lowered at the sight of strangers, stepping closer to Sandra for reassurance. The couple's faces filled with heartbreak but also confusion. The man knelt, extending a hand, calling softly, "Buddy." The woman's eyes flicked to Sandra. He kind of looks like our dog, but not exactly. She sounded unsure, as though the battered creature before her was a ghost of the dog she remembered. In halting words, they explained how their dog, named Rusty, ran away months ago when a firecracker was set off near their yard. They'd searched everywhere. The man's voice shook with guilt as he recounted how they'd only lived in that neighborhood for a few weeks. They suspected he got disoriented. They never saw him again. The woman produced photos on her phone. The dog in the pictures had similar coloring and a scar on his ear, but he looked healthier and younger. Their expressions begged for a confirmation that Chance was indeed Rusty. Sandra studied the photos. It was close, but not a perfect match. The scar was in a similar spot, but the shape of the dog's muzzle was slightly different. The coat pattern was reminiscent, though Chance's was scruffier. The vet examined Chance and also reviewed the photos. After a tense moment, she gently broke the news that while there were similarities, she was fairly certain they were looking at two different dogs. The dog in the photo had a distinct marking on the left flank, a white patch. Chance didn't have that. Relief flooded Sandra, mingled with a strange sadness as she saw the couple's shoulders slump. They realized their dog was still missing, lost somewhere else in the world. Tears welled up in their eyes. Sandra offered them sympathy, wishing she could have given them better news. The couple thanked her for her time and left, hearts heavy with disappointment. Sandra watched them go, feeling both sorrow for their loss and overwhelming relief that she wouldn't be separated from Chance. That evening, back home, she knelt beside him and gently cradled his face in her hands. "You're mine," she whispered, "and I'm yours, no matter what happened before." Chance gazed at her, tail softly thumping. She smiled through tears, pressing her forehead against his. In that moment, any lingering doubt about whether she was doing the right thing vanished. They belonged together. Time moved forward, and winter gave way to a gentle spring. Sandra's career stabilized, her superiors recognizing her dedication and resilience. The landlord issue never resurfaced, as neighbors grew accustomed to seeing the calm, limping dog who'd occasionally trot alongside Sandra in the hallway. Chance's nightmares became rarer, his trust in humans expanding cautiously beyond Sandra alone. He even allowed a few close friends to pet him and feed him treats. His scars, both physical and emotional, remained, but they no longer defined him. Late one warm evening, Sandra found herself reflecting on the remarkable chain of events. She stood on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Chance padded up beside her, pressing his body against her leg. The memory of finding him in that gutter felt like a distant dream, yet she could still recall every detail. The cold rain, his shallow breathing, her racing heart. And now here he was, alive, safe, and loved. The realization struck her with such force that tears welled up. She crouched, gathering him in her arms. He turned his head, looking at her with those deep eyes. She could almost imagine him thanking her for stopping that morning, for not driving past like everyone else. What if I had ignored that shape in the rain? She wondered. What if I had decided it was too much trouble to help? The thought made her chest tighten. The world was so vast and indifferent, and lives could slip away unnoticed. But for Chance, one small act of compassion had changed everything. And that thought lit a spark in her, an understanding that the smallest gestures can have immeasurable impact. She vowed never to underestimate the power of kindness again. She vowed to keep fighting for those who had no voices, whether they were animals or people struggling silently. Chance, in his quiet resilience, had taught her that. He was more than just a pet. He was a testimony to how healing flows both ways, how rescuing another can often rescue oneself. That night, as they settled onto the couch, Sandra's phone lit up with a text from a question about a volunteer opportunity at a local shelter. She smiled, stroking Chance's fur. Life had a way of guiding you once your heart was open. They sat there in the soft glow of a lamp, the hum of city traffic a distant lullaby. The dog who had once been discarded like trash was now cherished, living a new story shaped by warmth and hope. The stranger who had once been preoccupied with career ambitions now understood something profound about love and sacrifice. Outside, the wind rustled through budding leaves, carrying the soft promise of renewal. Chance sighed contentedly, resting his head on Sandra's lap, eyes drifting shut. In that serene moment, it struck her with breathtaking clarity. This was the ending of one story, the one marred by pain and solitude. But it was the beginning of another, a life where each moment was precious, each day a reminder of how far they'd come. She pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Chance's head. He was home. They both were. And though the scars would remain, etched into his body and her soul, they were no longer the marks of defeat. They were emblems of survival, of a bond forged by compassion, and of the undeniable truth that sometimes all it takes to save a life is to stop and notice, to reach out a hand, and to say, "I will help you."